I am at the UiPath Start screen, and I'm going to click on Process to start a new process, and I will call this process 04 Running a UiPath Workflow. I'll leave the rest at the defaults and click Create. I'm going to add a log message activity into our workflow, and the message I'm going to type in will be started-main workflow. I'm going to make the log level info, and I'm going to update this log message title to be log message dash started main workflow. The reason I want to make all our activity titles unique is because when we have a large workflow with 100 or more log message activities scattered throughout the code, and our UiPath code crashes on a log message activity, if there's nothing unique in the log message title, we will not immediately know which of the 100 log messages it crashed on. So that's the main reason I recommend we make the activity names unique, to help you and to help the people who have to debug the UiPath code when you're no longer on that project. Annotations are important too, probably not for activities this basic, but they are important, and we will annotate activities when needed. But sometimes too much information is just as bad as not enough information. Now I'm going to copy this log message activity and paste it right below. And I'm going to change started to ended. I'll do the same in the title. Change started to ended. And now my workflow is complete. I will save it, but before I save it, I'm going to point out that main has an asterisk up here showing that it is modified. I'm going to press Control S to save it, and our asterisk goes away, showing that main is now saved and has no new changes. Now I want to run this workflow, and as we saw in video 2, when I come up here to the debug file in the ribbon, we have three choices. We can run the file, debug, or run. To explain the difference between run file, debug, and run, I'm going to need to add a second workflow. It is really early in the tutorial series to introduce invoking a workflow, but it is needed to show the different ways to run a workflow. To add a second workflow, I'm going up to this new on the ribbon and clicking, where we see we've got a list of different things to choose from, including sequence, workflow, and state machine. And then below that, we have something called workflow. I'm going to click on workflow, and I will leave all the defaults and click create. When it's done, it looks just like our main workflow before we added anything to it. I will add another workflow under new. This time I'll click sequence. Leaving everything at the defaults, clicking create. We see that one looks similar to workflow. I will also add in a flowchart, and I will add in a state machine. Now the flowchart and the state machine look similar, whereas they both have that big play button in the upper left corner of the design window. But state machines and workflows are very different from each other, and both are different from the sequence. We will talk about flowcharts and state machines in a future video. For now, we're just going to keep in the back of our heads that flowcharts and state machines are different kinds of workflows. I'm going to delete the flowchart and the state machine from this process by clicking on Project, then right-clicking on State Machine and selecting Delete. Yes, I want to delete it. And I also want to delete this flowchart. Right-click, delete. And I'm going to click on the workflow. So we're inside this workflow. We see that the workflow does look just like the sequence. And for our purposes, it is the same as a sequence. Most of the time, I'm going to use a sequence. But since I have the workflow open now, I'm going to use that. And what I'm going to do is go into our activities and add a sequence into the workflow. to show that we can add a sequence activity in a workflow just like we can add a sequence into a sequence. We can also add a flowchart activity in by dragging it in from the left, or I can put my arrow on this plus sign and we see it says add activity with Control-Shift-T. So I will press Control-Shift-T and we get a drop down where I can type flowchart and use my arrow keys here. And when I'm over the flowchart, I'll press enter. We can also add an activity just by clicking on the plus sign. I'll click on this one and add in a state machine. And we can hover over that and click on state machine and add that in as well. And this works because sequence, state machine, and flowchart are all activities, and we can put any activity inside of any of the container activities. And when I say container activities, I'm talking specifically about the sequence activity, the flowchart activity, or the state machine activity. So I've been calling the sequence an activity and a workflow. So when is our sequence considered a workflow? Well, some people will say that a sequence is a workflow when it's a separate file. Others will say it's a workflow whenever there are two or more activities in it. In general, there are three different kinds of workflows: sequence, flowchart, and state machine. And the sequence is the easiest to understand, so we're going to stick with that one, at least for now. I'm going to delete this workflow from our project by coming over to Project, right-clicking on Workflow, and clicking Delete. Yes, I want to delete it. Now we just have our main, which has our two log message activities in it, and our sequence, which has nothing in it. I'm going to add a log message activity, and the message I will paste in is, this is from inside of the sequence. I'll make the log level info and update this title to be log message inside of the sequence. Now I'm going up to the Run button, and I'm going to click on Run File because I want to run just this one workflow file. A couple of things I want to point out here before we continue. When I ran the job, UiPath minimized itself while it ran. I don't want that feature on right now, so I'm going to the home screen, Settings, then clicking on Design, and way down on the bottom here we see Minimize on Run. I'm going to turn that off. And now I'm going back to our project. And another thing I want to do is show the output window in this left panel here. We talked about doing that in the last video. So I'm going to click on Output, drag the title bar over to the left, and I want it to be on the bottom of this panel. So now we can see the output from our last run. Looking at the messages in this output panel, we see the execution started for this file sequence. Then it shows us the title. This is the title from up at the top of the screen here. 04, running a UiPath workflow execution started. Then we see our log message. This is from inside of the sequence from right here. And then we see that 04 running a UiPath workflow execution has ended in 0 seconds, or less than 1/10 of a second. Now let's look at these buttons at the top of the output. This far left one, when I hover over it, it says show timestamps. And clicking on that shows the time and date for each of our output messages, just as we would expect. Looking at the next 4 buttons, we have error, warning, information, and trace. And notice those 4 categories are also in the log level. Error, warn, info, trace. But we also have fatal. Why don't we have a fatal button? Because you should only use the fatal button when the program is about to end, and that message should be the last message in the output log. If it's not, then it was not fatal since your program did not end. So since we have no error and no warning, I'm going to click on the information button. And notice it toggles off and on the information messages. Clicking the trace button does the same thing, toggles off and on the trace messages. So what is the difference between an informational message and a trace message? Remember in an earlier video, we talked about running our jobs from Orchestrator. Orchestrator is our production environment where we want to run our UiPath workflows from, and Orchestrator will keep the log files when the job is run. In short, Orchestrator will not keep trace log messages. And the reason is you might want to write out some trace messages showing information about how much longer the workflow is running. But once that job is complete, you don't care about those messages because the job is complete. Some people disagree and think that all log messages should be kept and you should never use trace messages. Well, the option is available. You don't have to use it. We also have a write line activity, and I'll paste in a message here. This is a write line message, and I will run this with the run file. And now when we filter out the information messages, we see that a write line message is the same thing as a trace level log message. So now I'm in the sequence workflow and I want to run everything from the main, but I'm in the sequence. So this time I want to click run, or I can press Control F5. Our job is running. We can see it on the left. And we notice that this time we see started main workflow, ended main workflow. And it didn't run this sequence at all because I don't have that in the main workflow. So let's add that in right now. I'm going into Project, and I'm going to add this sequence workflow between the two log messages. And I'm going to press Control S to save this, going back into the sequence. And this time I'm going to run the file, showing that it will run just this file. And then this time I will run it again, but I'm going to run it from the main. And here we see started main workflow. This is from inside a sequence. Here is our write line message, then it ended the main workflow. So there's our difference between run file and run. So right now, if I click debug from either main or the sequence, it's going to do the same thing. It's just going to run the entire activity from main. Let's try that from sequence. Debug. And here we see it just ran everything, just like when we clicked the run. So let's get into the sequence again. And I'm going to right click on this log message, and I will click on toggle breakpoint, or I could press F9. It will do the same thing. And we see a red dot appears next to that activity showing that a breakpoint is enabled. Let's run this again, only this time I'll use debug. And we see that it started from the main workflow because we have our log message started main workflow here. We're at a breakpoint. To continue running the program, I will click the continue button. And we see that our job successfully completed. Now, if we click run, I'm still in the sequence. And if we click run, it will run our job from start to finish and skip any breakpoints. So in this video, we discussed what a workflow is, the difference between run file, and debug, and we had a little introduction to invoking a workflow and breakpoints, both of which will be covered in more detail in future tutorials.